The chandeliers above the Ashbury Conservatory had been polished that morning by three women who would never set foot in the room they were preparing. Their crystals hung in long tiered cascades from a domed ceiling painted with faded gold leaf, and when the lights came up at 7:30, the whole ballroom looked as if it had been dipped in honey. Strings of ivory roses traced the balconies. Gilded chairs lined the parquet floor in concentric arcs around a small raised stage. A quartet played something soft and old by the east windows, and the air smelled faintly of beeswax and the perfume of women who had spent more on their dresses than most people earned in a season. It was the kind of room that did not forgive a wrong dress. The pairing auction had been a tradition at the Bellrook Children's Benefit for 38 years. Eligible guests were called to the stage one by one, and bids were placed not in dollars but in pledges to St. Adelaide Children's Hospital, with each pairing announced as a kind of social blessing. Most of the guests treated it as theater. A few treated it as a hunt. And the woman currently being walked toward the stage by an organizer who had mistaken her name on the guest list had not known the auction was happening at all. Her name was Marin Holloway. She was 29 years old. Her dress was dove gray, 2 seasons out of fashion, and she had bought it for her husband's memorial service 18 months ago. She had not owned a reason to wear it since. The man already standing on the stage was named Hollis Pemberton. He was 36, an heir to a shipping fortune, and he had been told before the auction began that he would be paired with a woman whose family had donated a wing to the hospital the previous spring. When he saw Marin instead, in her dove-gray dress and her plain shoes, and the small pewter locket at her throat, his mouth made a shape that the audience would remember for years. "Choose someone else," he said into the microphone, and he said it with a smile, and the room laughed. It was not a kind laugh. It was the laugh of people who had been waiting for permission to laugh, and who took the permission gladly. It rolled across the parquet floor and climbed the balconies and rang against the gold leaf ceiling, and somewhere above them, a single crystal slipped loose from a chandelier and struck the marble below with a small bright sound that no one heard except a man standing alone at the back of the hall. Crane Vosberg had been holding a glass of water he had not yet drunk. He set it down on the tray of a passing server without looking. His eyes had not left the stage since the laughter began, because men like him were used to silence in places, the kind of silence that arrived when he entered, the kind of silence that was a form of address. And what he had just heard was the opposite of silence. It was a crowd finding its cruelty together, the way a flock of birds finds a thermal, and rising on it. Even a man who had built a life on knowing when to look away could not look away from this. Bellrook was a city that had once made things and now made arrangements. Its harbor had been the third largest on the eastern seaboard 100 years ago, and the wealth that came in by ship had built the row houses on Linden Hill and the old stone churches at the river bend and the conservatory itself, whose dome had been modeled on a hall in Vienna by a man who had never been to Vienna. The mills along the waterfront had closed before most of the current guests had been born. The shipping had moved south. What remained of the old industries had been replaced by what the city called philanthropy, and what its older residents still called tribute. The slow, ritualized movement of money from those who had inherited it to causes that allowed them to be photographed beside it. The Ashbury Conservatory sat at the top of Linden Hill, behind a row of iron gates whose paint had been retouched 11 times since the war. Its windows looked east over the river, and on a clear evening a guest could stand at the balcony and see the lights of the working districts laid out below like a constellation that had fallen and never quite gotten up. From inside the ballroom, of course, no one looked at the working districts. The guests faced the stage, and the stage faced the guests, and the world beyond the windows was a backdrop that had been agreed upon long ago to remain decorative. There was a kind of forgetting built into places like this. It was the same forgetting that lived in the chipped paint of an empty park bench across town, in the shuttered diners off the harbor, In the apartments where the women who had polished the chandeliers that morning were now sitting down to dinner with their own children. The conservatory remembered nothing. It remembered no debts paid in its name and no kindnesses performed under its dome. It only remembered who had been laughed at, and it kept those memories the way a glass keeps a fingerprint, invisible until the right light caught it. By the end of the night, the conservatory would have a new fingerprint to keep. Marin Holloway had not wanted to come. She had stood in the bathroom of her apartment for half an hour that afternoon, holding the dove-gray dress against her body in front of a mirror that had once belonged to her grandmother, and she had argued with herself the way she argued with herself about most things now, quietly, patiently, as if she were two different women who had agreed to share a body until further notice. The first woman had said, "You promised him." The second woman had said, "He won't know." And the first woman, who almost always won, had said, "But you will." She had pinned her brown hair back with two small silver clips that her sister had sent her in a card the previous Christmas. She had put on the locket Wesley had given her on their second anniversary, a small oval of pewter on a chain so fine it nearly disappeared against her skin. She had not put on lipstick because the only tube she owned had been purchased for the memorial, and she had decided 18 months ago that she would never wear that particular shade again. She had taken a taxi to the conservatory because her car had been in the shop for 3 weeks, and she had not yet decided whether she could afford to get it out. Her shoes were the wrong shoes. She had known that the moment she stepped onto the parquet. The other women's heels made small, precise sounds, like punctuation, and her own flats made no sound at all, which was somehow worse. She had walked to the perimeter of the hall and stood near a column and tried to make herself the shape of a woman who belonged there. She had failed. She had known she would fail. She had come anyway because 18 months ago, on a hospital bed at St. Adelaide's, Wesley had taken her hand and asked her to attend the next benefit in his place. And she had said yes, and she had not yet learned how to say no to a man who was no longer alive. The locket at her throat was the warmest thing she was wearing. She touched it when the organizer first approached her with the clipboard. She touched it again when the woman read the wrong name, and Marin opened her mouth to correct her, and then closed it, because correcting her felt suddenly like a larger act than walking onto the stage, and Marin Holloway had not had the strength for larger acts in a long time. She touched the locket a third time as she walked, and her thumb found the small clasp on the back, and inside the clasp, though no one in the building would ever see it, was a folded scrap of paper with a list in her late husband's handwriting, and that list was the only reason she was still standing upright at all. She did not know yet that someone in the hall had already noticed her hand returning to her throat. Wesley Holloway had been 34 years old when the diagnosis arrived. He had been a pediatric cardiothoracic surgeon at St. Adelaide's for 6 years. He had operated on infants whose hearts were the size of strawberries. He had a way of speaking to children that made them stop crying within the first 3 sentences, and a way of speaking to their parents that made them feel, for the duration of the conversation, that the worst thing in their life was being witnessed by someone who would not look away. He had married Maureen in a small ceremony at the River Bend Church when she was 25, and he had told her on their wedding night that he intended to grow old slowly, with her, in a house with too many windows. The diagnosis was a kind of cancer that the medical journals described in cautious paragraphs and that the doctors at his own hospital described in shorter ones. He had 11 months. He spent the first part of them working, then pretending to work, which Maureen had only realized later when she went through his desk and found the appointment notes he had written for himself in his own handwriting, scheduling pretend surgeries on days he had spent in the chemotherapy chair. He spent the middle months at home, in the kitchen mostly, teaching her how to make the soup his mother had made when he was a child, because he had decided that the soup was the most important thing he could leave her, and because he was a man who believed that small concrete things outlasted speeches. He spent the last week saying goodbye in installments. He said goodbye to his colleagues one at a time over coffee. He said goodbye to his patients by writing each of them a letter. He said goodbye to Marin by handing her a list, on a Tuesday afternoon in October, of 7 things he wanted her to do after he was gone. The list was written on a folded scrap of hospital notepaper. It said, "Sleep with the window open. Plant something every spring. Eat the soup when you forget who you are. Keep the piano even when it hurts. Go to the Bellrook benefit. Once. For me. Be kind to the next man who notices you. Remember that I saw you. Always." She had folded the list into the back of her locket the day after the funeral, and she had not opened it since, because the paper had become a kind of relic, and relics were ruined by being looked at. But she knew the 7 lines by heart. She had known them on the morning the bills started arriving from the hospital that had not been able to save him, and she had known them on the afternoon her sister had stopped returning her calls, because grief was contagious in a way that frightened people. And she had known them on the evening she had walked into a pawn shop with her grandmother's rings in a velvet pouch and walked out with an envelope that paid 1 month of her rent. She had not, in 18 months, been kind to any man who noticed her, because no man had noticed her. That was the part of the list that had quietly broken her. Not the soup, not the piano, not the planting, the 6th line. Because the 6th line presumed a future, and Marin had not been able to imagine a future since the morning she had woken up at 4 a.m. and reached across the bed and found the sheets cold. She had kept the piano. It was the only line on the list she had kept, and she had kept it by accident, because she had not had the strength to make the call to the consignment shop. The piano stood against the long wall of her apartment, dust on the lid, the bench unmoved since the night before he died, and she had not played a note on it in 18 months. She had not touched it either. She walked past it twice a day. She did not look at it. The 5th line had brought her to the conservatory. She had told herself on the taxi ride up Linden Hill that she would only stay for the opening remarks. She would put her name in the book at the door. She would let the chairwoman shake her hand and say the practiced words about Wesley's legacy. And she would slip out before the auction began, because she had read the program and had known the auction was coming, and had decided, with the hard, small certainty she used now to make all her decisions, that she would not be in the hall when it started. But the chairwoman had been delayed. The opening remarks had run long. The organizer with the clipboard had appeared at her elbow with a smile that did not require an answer, and a name on the list that was not Marin's name, but the name of a woman who had not arrived. And by the time Marin had understood what was happening, she was already walking, and the audience was already turning to look, and the locket at her throat was already the warmest thing in the building. She had thought, as she walked, that perhaps this was the 6th line announcing itself. Perhaps a man on the stage was about to notice her, and she would be kind to him, and Wesley would be proven right one more time about a future she had refused to imagine. She had been wrong about which man. The laughter did not stop all at once. It moved through the hall in waves the way weather moves across a field. First the people closest to the stage, who took their cue from Hollis Pemberton's smile, and then the second ring of guests, who took their cue from the first, and then the back of the building, where the laughter was thinner and more uncertain, the laughter of people who had not seen the woman's face yet, and were laughing on faith. By the time the wave reached the rear wall of the conservatory, where Crane Vosberg was standing, the front had already begun to laugh a second time, because Hollis had turned to the auctioneer with a small theatrical shrug, and the shrug was funnier than the line. Marin had stopped walking 3 steps from the stage. She did not turn around. She did not lift her chin. She did not do any of the things that women in stories were said to do in moments like this. She stood in her dove-gray dress with her hand at her throat and her thumb pressed against the small pewter clasp, and she looked at the parquet floor, and she counted. She counted the way Wesley had taught her to count on the night before his first surgery as the lead, when his hands had shaken at the kitchen table and he had said, "Count something, Marin. Anything. Just count it slowly." And she had counted the tiles on the backsplash, and his hands had stilled. And the next morning he had saved a 4-month-old's life. She counted the boards of the parquet now. She counted 7 before she lost the line. She started again. The auctioneer cleared his throat into the microphone. He was a small man in a tuxedo 2 sizes too large, and he had been doing this for 19 years, and he had never, in all those years, been handed a moment he did not know how to spend. He spent this one badly. He laughed too. He said, "Well, ladies and gentlemen, perhaps we have a substitution to consider." And the audience laughed a third time, smaller now, embarrassed but committed, the way a crowd laughs when it has already decided what kind of crowd it is going to be. Hollis Pemberton leaned toward the microphone. He was, in his own mind, being gracious. He believed he was diffusing an awkward situation with a light touch. He had been raised in a house where light touches were the highest form of kindness, and he had never once, in 36 years, been required to imagine the inside of a woman who had buried her husband 18 months ago and was standing in a hall full of people who did not know her name. "I'm sure," he said, smiling at the auctioneer, "that there's a more suitable arrangement for the evening. Perhaps the lady would prefer to enjoy the rest of the program from the audience." The crowd made a small sound. It was not quite laughter this time. It was something worse, the sound of an entire ballroom agreeing. And it was that sound, more than any of the laughter, that did the damage. Because laughter could be excused. Laughter was a reflex. But agreement was a decision. And the decision had been made. And the decision had been ratified. And Marin Holloway was now standing 3 steps from a stage that the entire conservatory had agreed she did not belong on. She closed her eyes. She thought very clearly of the soup. She thought of the kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, and Wesley standing at the stove with a wooden spoon and saying the broth is the part that holds it. And she thought of his hands and the way he had washed them after every shift with a particular brand of soap that smelled like cedar. And she thought of the 4-month-old he had saved and the parents who had named the child after him. And she thought of the 7 lines folded against her sternum, and she did not cry. She had not cried in public in 18 months. She had a system for it. The system was holding. But what made the moment unbearable, what made it the kind of moment that would later be told in 2 different versions in 2 different parts of Bellrook for years afterward, was not the laughter and not the agreement, and not even the small cruel shrug from Hollis Pemberton. It was the fact that Marin Holloway, standing 3 steps from the stage with her eyes closed and her hand at her throat, had begun, very quietly, to apologize. She had not meant to. Her lips had moved before her mind had caught them. She had whispered, "I'm sorry," to no one, to everyone, to a hall that had not asked for her apology and would not have known what to do with it if it had heard. She had apologized for the dress. She had apologized for the shoes. She had apologized for being the woman whose name had not been on the list. She had apologized, in the privacy of 3 breaths, for the fact of her own presence in a place that had decided she was not enough. And that was the thing that had reached the back of the conservatory. Not the words. No one heard the words. The shape of them. The small movement of her mouth. The way a woman in a dove-gray dress had begun to apologize for existing in front of a crowd that had given her no reason to. A man at the rear of the hall saw it and understood it, because he had once watched another woman do the same thing in a different doorway a long time ago, and he had been too young then to stop it. He was not too young now. Crane Vosberg was 64 years old. He stood 6 feet and 1 inch tall, and he carried his weight the way men carry weight who had once been bigger and had chosen, deliberately, to become smaller. not through illness but through discipline, the way a blade is honed by being narrowed. His hair was the color of wet slate, cut close at the sides. His eyes were a pale, unsettled brown, and the left one had a small fleck of gray near the iris that most people never noticed, because most people did not look at Crane Vosburg long enough to notice anything. His suit had been made for him in a small shop on Brevard Street by a tailor named Aldous Mering, who had been making Crane's suits for 26 years, and who had once told his apprentice that Mr. Vosburg's measurements had not changed by more than a quarter-inch in all that time, and that this, more than any of the stories, was what frightened him about the man. Crane did not run a business. He ran an arrangement. The arrangement extended across 4 counties along the eastern seaboard, and it touched the harbor, and it touched the freight yards, and it touched a number of other concerns that the city's older residents did not name aloud at dinner parties. He employed 173 men directly, and another 200 or so indirectly. He had a lawyer named Imogen Drexler, who had once made a federal prosecutor cry in a deposition without raising her voice. He had a man named Coleridge Sands, who had worked beside him for 19 years and had never, in all those years, asked a question that was not necessary. He had the private numbers of 3 judges, 2 senators, and 1 cardinal. And he had the kind of reputation that arrived in a place before he did and remained after he left, the way smoke remains after a fire. He had given the Children's Hospital $9 million over the past 11 years. He had given it under 3 different names, none of which were his, because Crane Vosburg did not believe in being photographed beside his own kindness. He had come to the benefit tonight because the chairwoman of the hospital, a woman named Adair Pennick, had asked him personally, and because Adair Pennick was one of the few people in the city who had ever spoken to him as if he were a man rather than a rumor, and because he owed her a debt that had nothing to do with money. He had been standing at the back of the hall for half an hour. He had spoken to no one. He had drunk no champagne. He had watched the auction begin with the same mild distaste with which he watched most of the city's rituals, and he had been preparing to leave when the woman in the dove-gray dress had been walked toward the stage by an organizer who did not know what she was doing. He had recognized the dress immediately. Not the dress itself, but what the dress meant. He had grown up in a house where his own mother had owned exactly 2 dresses, and one of them had been gray, and she had worn it to every occasion that mattered for 16 years, until the gray became a kind of skin, and he had watched her, at the age of 9, be turned away from the front door of a parish hall in Halverton, Pennsylvania, by a deacon who had told her, kindly, the way Hollis Pemberton had spoken kindly, that the celebration was for contributing families, and that she might be more comfortable observing from the kitchen. His mother's name had been Ottilie Vosburg. She had worked at a laundry. She had raised him alone after his father had walked into the harbor at Christmas the year Crane was 4, and she had taken every blow the world had thought to give her, and she had taken them quietly, because she had believed that quietness was a form of dignity. She had stood in the doorway of the parish hall in her gray dress with her hand at her throat. At her throat, because she too had worn a small piece of jewelry, a thin tin pendant her own mother had given her. And she had whispered something that the deacon had not heard, and that 9-year-old Crane, standing behind her, had heard perfectly. She had said, "I'm sorry." She had apologized to a man who had just turned her away. She had apologized for the dress, for the shoes, for the fact of her own presence in a place that had decided she was not enough. And 9-year-old Crane Vosburg had stood in the doorway and watched his mother apologize for existing, and he had promised himself, with the hard, bright certainty that only children are capable of, that he would never again be in a place where a woman was made to apologize for existing without him doing something about it. He had not kept the promise. He had been too young at first, and then too poor, and then too useful to other men, and then too busy becoming the man whose name was a rumor, and the years had passed, and the promise had become a thing he carried the way other men carried photographs in their wallets, folded, faded, no longer looked at, but never thrown away. His mother had died when he was 23. Not of any single thing. From the accumulated weight of a life spent apologizing. He had not let himself think of that doorway in years. He had walled it off the way men in his line walled off the things that could still move them, because a man who could be moved was a man who could be reached. And a man who could be reached was a man who could be taken from. He had sealed the doorway and gone on without it. And he had been very good at going on without it, until tonight. But standing at the back of the Ashbury Conservatory with a glass of water he had not drunk, and a woman in a dove-gray dress 3 steps from a stage she had not asked to be on, the doorway opened. The memory came back with a force that took the air out of his chest and set it down somewhere on the parquet floor between him and her. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit and took out his phone. He sent a single message to Coleridge Sands, who was waiting in a car at the foot of Linden Hill. "Stay close. This is going to take some time." He put the phone away. He stepped forward from the back wall of the conservatory. He began to walk toward the stage. The walk from the rear wall of the conservatory to the foot of the stage was 42 paces. Crane Vosburgh counted them out of habit. He had counted paces in unfamiliar halls since he was 19, since the night a man named Felton Brace had taught him that a place was a kind of map, and a man who could not read the map would die in it. He counted now, not because he expected to die in the Ashbury Conservatory, but because counting kept his hands still, and his hands needed to be still. The crowd saw him before the auctioneer did. There was a particular silence that traveled with Crane Vosburgh, and the silence reached the front of the building a half-second ahead of his body. The laughter, which had been settling into the comfortable, warm afterlife of laughter, simply stopped. It did not fade. It did not taper. It stopped, the way a record stops when the needle is lifted. The quartet by the east windows played one more bar before they too understood what was happening, and then the violinist's bow lifted off the strings and stayed lifted, and the only sound in the entire ballroom was the small, precise tap of Crane's shoes on the parquet floor. Hollis Pemberton saw him at pace 28. The smile on Hollis's face did a particular thing then. It did not vanish. Smiles trained from childhood do not vanish. It thinned. It became a smile that was trying to remember why it had been a smile in the first place, and failing. At pace 36, Crane stopped. He was standing 5 feet from Marin Holloway. He did not look at the stage. He did not look at Hollis. He did not look at the auctioneer or the chairwoman or the 400 guests who had, 60 seconds earlier, agreed that the woman in the dove-gray dress did not belong on the stage. He looked only at Marine, and he kept a careful distance, and he kept his hands visible at his sides. "Mrs. Holloway," he said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The conservatory's dome carried sound the way water carries oil, and the syllables of her married name moved across the parquet and reached every corner of the building before the second word was out of his mouth. Somewhere on the second balcony, a woman who had been laughing 30 seconds earlier put her hand to her mouth, because she had known Wesley, and she had not, until this moment, recognized his widow. Marin opened her eyes. She did not turn her head. She tilted it, slightly, the way a bird tilts its head when it is trying to decide whether the shape it sees is a threat or a stone. Her thumb was still on the clasp of the locket. Her counting had stopped at 4. "I don't know you," she said, and her voice surprised her because it came out steady. It came out the way Wesley had taught her to count things at the kitchen table. Slowly. Anything. Just slowly. "No," Crane said. "You don't." He let the answer sit. He had learned, a long time ago, that the most powerful word in any language was the one a man chose not to say next. He waited. He did not fill the space. He let her decide whether the conversation would continue, because a conversation that a person had not been allowed to refuse was not a conversation, and Crane Vosberg, whatever else he was not a man who took conversations from women in dove-gray dresses who had already had too much taken from them in one evening. The hall waited with him. 400 people, whose attention had been a weapon 30 seconds earlier, were now an audience to a private exchange they had not been invited into, and the discomfort of being uninvited to a moment they had created was beginning, slowly, to settle into them. "What do you want?" Marin asked. "I'd like to ask you something," Crane said. "And I'd like you to know, before I ask it, that no is the right answer if no is the answer you want to give. The crowd will respect it. I'll see to that." Marin almost laughed. It was not a kind laugh either, but it was hers. "The crowd hasn't respected anything tonight. It hadn't met me yet." It was not a threat. He did not deliver it as a threat. He delivered it the way a man delivers a weather report. Flat, factual, with the small private weariness of someone who would have preferred a different sky. But the audience heard it, and the audience understood, and on the second balcony, the woman who had recognized Wesley's name took 2 steps backward, because she had recognized the second name now too, and she had recognized it from her husband's office, and her husband had told her once, in the particular tone he used for things that were not jokes, that there were certain men in Belrook whose attention you did not want, and whose attention, once obtained, was not negotiable. Marin looked at him fully for the first time. She saw the slate hair, the unsettled brown eyes, and the small gray fleck near the left iris. She saw a man her father's age, dressed in a suit that had cost more than her car, standing in the middle of a ballroom that had just laughed at her, asking her permission to ask her something. She did not know who he was. The fact did not seem important. She had spent 18 months being treated as a problem the world was politely waiting to solve itself. She had not, in those 18 months, been asked permission for anything. "Ask it," she said. "I would like," Crane said, "to be paired with you for the evening's program. The pledge will go to St. Adelaide's. The pledge will be larger than any other pledge of the evening. And after the program, I will see you to a car of your choosing. And you will not see me again unless you wish to." The auctioneer made a small sound at his microphone. Crane did not look at him. The auctioneer stopped making the sound. Marin's thumb pressed once against the clasp of the locket. She thought of the 6th line. "Be kind to the next man who notices you." She thought also of the fact that the man in front of her had not, in any meaningful sense, noticed her. He had noticed something else. She did not yet know what. But she had spent enough time in hospital rooms and lawyers' offices, and the small bright spaces where the bills were itemized, to know the difference between a man who saw a woman and a man who saw something through her. A memory, a debt, a wound he had been carrying for so long he had forgotten the shape of it. The man in front of her was the second kind. She did not know why that made her trust him. It should not have. But it did, because the men who had hurt her in the past 18 months had all been the first kind, men who had looked at her and seen exactly what was there, and had decided that what was there was not enough. A man who looked at her and saw something else was, for the first time in a long while, a man whose answer she could not predict. And an answer she could not predict was, she realized, the only kind of answer she still had any use for. "All right," she said. She did not say yes. She said, "All right," the way a person says it at the end of a long argument with themselves. And Crane Vosberg, who had heard every form of consent and refusal a human voice was capable of producing, recognized the words for what they were. Not agreement, permission. The smallest, most carefully measured permission a woman could grant, and the only kind that was worth being granted. He inclined his head. He did not smile. He did not offer his arm. He turned to the auctioneer. $200,000, he said, to St. Adelaide's, in the name of Dr. Wesley Holloway. The audience made a sound. It was the sound of 400 people understanding, simultaneously, that they had spent the last 90 seconds in a place they did not understand, with a man they did not know, laughing at a woman whose dead husband's name had just been spoken aloud in a pledge that exceeded the entire evening's projected total. It was the sound of a crowd recognizing, all at once, what it had done. Marin Holloway did not look at them. She had found, somewhere in the last 42 paces, that she had no use for their faces. The auction did not continue. The chairwoman, Adair Pennock, took the stage with the practiced grace of a woman who had been rescuing public events for 31 years, and she announced, with no acknowledgement of what had occurred, that the program would proceed to the dinner service, and she descended the stage and crossed the parquet directly to Crane Vosberg, and she said 3 words to him in a voice low enough that only he and Marin heard them. The 3 words were, "Use the library." The library at the Ashbury Conservatory was not, in any practical sense, a library. It was a small, high-ceilinged study off the eastern hallway, lined with books that had been purchased by the Linear Foot in the 1920s to give the conservatory an air of learning, and it was used now only for private conversations that the rest of the building was not meant to overhear. There were 2 leather chairs by a fireplace that had not been lit in 2 decades, a small table between them, and a single tall window that looked out over the river. Coleridge Sands stood in the hallway outside the door without being asked, and the door closed behind Marin and Crane with a small precise sound that was not quite a click. Crane gestured to one of the chairs. He waited until Marin sat. He sat in the other. He did not speak. He had learned, a long time ago, that silence in a small space was a different substance than silence in a large one. In a ballroom, silence was an absence. In a library, silence was a presence, a third party in the conversation, a witness with its own opinions. He let the silence be present. He let it occupy the space between them. He let Marin Holloway use it for whatever she required. She used it to cry. She did not cry the way she had not cried in the ballroom. She cried the way a woman cries who has finally been given a place small enough to contain her. The tears came without sound. They moved down her face in 2 thin lines, and she did not lift her hands to wipe them, because lifting her hands would have been an admission, and she was not yet ready to admit. Her thumb stayed on the clasp of the locket. Her counting had not resumed. Crane reached into his jacket. He took out a clean, folded handkerchief, pressed cotton, no monogram, and he set it on the small table between them, within her reach, and he withdrew his hand without offering it. "Thank you," she said, after a long time. "You don't need to thank me. I wasn't thanking you for the pledge." "I know." She picked up the handkerchief. She did not use it on her face. She held it in her lap, folded, the way a woman holds something she has been given to hold, but has not yet decided to use. She looked at the unlit fireplace. "He worked there for 6 years, she said. "St. Adelaide's. He was supposed to retire there. He was supposed to be one of those old men in a cardigan who scared the residents and made the children laugh. He had a whole plan. He had names picked out for the children we were going to have. He had a sabbatical year in mind for when we'd take them to Lisbon, because his grandfather was from Lisbon, and he wanted them to know what his grandfather's bread had tasted like." She paused. "He died 11 months after the diagnosis. He used the 11 months better than most people use 11 decades. And then he was gone, and the bills came, and the bills did not stop coming, because it turns out that when a hospital cannot save your husband, they still send you the invoice for the trying." Crane said nothing. He had a question forming behind his teeth, but he did not ask it. He had learned that the questions that mattered most were the ones a man did not ask. People answered them anyway. "I owe $142,000, Marin said, "to 3 different collection agencies. The hospital sold the debt 8 months ago. I've been paying what I can. I sold his car. I sold the rings my grandmother left me. I have a job at a stationer's on Pearl Street that pays me $11 an hour, and I take the bus. Except when the bus is late. And the bus is often late. And on those days, I walk. And on the days when I walk, I think about how he would have hated that I was walking, and I think about how he would have hated even more that I was thinking about how he would have hated it, because he believed that grief was a thing you put down eventually, and I have not put mine down, and I do not know how to put it down. And I came tonight because he asked me to, and I almost did not come, and I am sitting in a room with a man whose name I do not know, telling him things I have not told my own sister in 11 months. She stopped. She looked at the handkerchief in her lap. Why am I telling you this? Because you've been carrying it, Crane said, and a thing that has been carried for 18 months is heavier than a thing that has been carried for 2. And the chair you are sitting in is the first chair in 18 months that has not asked you to keep carrying it. Marin closed her eyes. What's your name? She asked. Crane Vosberg. She opened her eyes. She looked at him. She did not, he noticed, react to the name the way most people reacted to the name. She did not flinch. She did not stiffen. She simply looked at him as if the name were a piece of information she was now in possession of, and she would decide later what to do with it. You said your mother, she said. I didn't, yet. You're going to. He almost smiled. He did not. He looked at the unlit fireplace instead. Her name was Attilly, he said. She raised me alone. She owned 2 dresses. She wore the gray one to a parish celebration in Halverton, Pennsylvania, in 1971, and she was turned away at the door by a man who told her the celebration was for contributing families, and she stood in the doorway and she said, I'm sorry, to the man who had just turned her away. And I was 9 years old and I was standing behind her, and I have not, in 55 years, been able to forget the shape her mouth made when she said it. He paused. She died when I was 23. Not of any one thing. Of the accumulated weight of a life that had asked her to apologize for existing. I promised her, when she was dying, that I would not be present again where a woman was made to do that. I have broken that promise many times. I have broken it because I was elsewhere, or because I did not see, or because I saw and chose not to see. And every time I have broken it, the breaking has cost me something. Tonight I was at the back of the hall. I saw your mouth make the shape my mother's mouth made. I heard the audience make the sound that the parish hall made. And I decided, in the time it took to walk 42 paces, that I would not break the promise tonight. He turned his face toward her. The pale brown eyes with the gray fleck were steady. That is why, he said, and that is the only why. You owe me nothing. The pledge is not a debt. The audience outside is not a debt. I will see you to a car at the end of the evening, and I will not contact you again unless you contact me. And the matter of the $142,000 and the 3 collection agencies will be handled by Tuesday, and you will not be told how. You will simply find on Tuesday morning that the calls have stopped. You may decide for yourself what to make of that. Marin stared at him. I can't accept that. You're not accepting it. I'm doing it. The decision of what it means is the only decision I'm leaving you. She lifted the handkerchief, finally, to her face. She wept into it for a long time, and Crane Vosberg did not look away, and he did not look at her either. He looked at the unlit fireplace, and he kept the silence company, and he thought about a woman in a gray dress in a doorway in Halverton, Pennsylvania, in the spring of 1971, and he thought, for the first time in a very long time, that perhaps the promise had been worth keeping after all. Coleridge Sands had been waiting in the hallway when the library door opened. He did not look at his watch. He had not looked at his watch in 19 years of working for Crane Vosberg, because looking at one's watch in front of Mr. Vosberg was a form of complaint, and Coleridge Sands did not complain. Crane stepped out of the library. Marin remained inside, sitting in the leather chair, holding the handkerchief. The door stayed open. Coleridge. Sir. 3 things. Sir. First, Imogen. Tonight. I want her on the phone with Mrs. Holloway in the morning. The matter is medical debt. 3 agencies, $142,000. The underlying creditor was St. Adelaide's, and the debt was sold 8 months ago. I want it settled by Tuesday. I want every record of the debt expunged from her credit reporting. I want the agencies notified in writing that further contact will be met with action. Imogen will know what action. She does not need to be told. Sir. Second, the car. I want the Holloway vehicle out of whatever shop it is in by tomorrow morning. The bill paid. The car returned to her building by noon. If the shop has been holding it for non-payment, the shop will be told that the bill has been settled and that any future work for Mrs. Holloway will be done at cost. The owner of the shop may decide for himself whether he agrees with that arrangement. He will agree. Sir. Third, Hollis Pemberton. Coleridge waited. Nothing direct, Crane said. I do not want the boy harmed. I do not want the boy threatened. I want the shipping contracts that his family's firm holds with the harbor reviewed at the next board meeting, and I want the review to be thorough. Pemberton Shipping has been operating on grandfathered terms for 11 years. The grandfather is dead. The terms can be renegotiated. I would like them renegotiated by the end of the quarter, and I would like Hollis Pemberton, who is the company's heir apparent, to spend the next several months explaining to his board why the renegotiation occurred. He will not be told why. He will be left to wonder. Wondering will be the lesson. Sir. That's all. Sir. Coleridge inclined his head and stepped away to make the calls, and Crane Vosberg turned back to the library and to the woman in the dove-gray dress who was sitting in the leather chair with a handkerchief in her lap and a locket at her throat, and he thought, not for the first time in his life, that the most powerful thing a man could do was the thing that no one would ever know he had done. He stepped back inside. He closed the door. Mrs. Holloway, he said, there is a car waiting for you at the side entrance. The driver's name is Petrus. He has been with me for 12 years. He will take you wherever you wish to go. He will not ask you any questions, and he will not report your destination to me. That is a condition of his employment, and it is a condition he has honored without exception for 12 years. Marin nodded. Tomorrow morning, Crane continued, a woman named Imogen Drexler will call you. She is an attorney. She is the best one I know. She will ask you for some documents, bills, letters, anything you have received from the collection agencies, and she will handle the rest. You will not see a bill from her. The matter of her fee is between her and me. You will not be asked, ever, to repay any portion of what is being done. I will not contact you again. If you wish to contact me, Coleridge will give you a number. The number is mine. It is not used by anyone else. If you ever call it, I will answer. If you never call it, I will understand. Marin looked at him for a long time. Why did you tell me your name? She asked. Because you asked. You don't tell people your name. I don't. Generally. Then why? Crane considered the question. He considered it the way he considered most questions. Slowly, without performance, as a man considers a stone before deciding which pocket to put it in. Because, he said, if I had not told you, the kindness would have been a transaction. A man who does not give his name is a man who is purchasing something. I was not purchasing anything. The name was the proof. Marin looked down at the handkerchief. Mr. Vosberg. Yes. My husband used to say that the broth is the part that holds it. I never understood what he meant. I think I might be starting to. She lifted her face. Her eyes were red, but they were steady. Thank you, she said. Not for the pledge, not for the debt, for the chair. He inclined his head, the smallest fraction of an inch, and he stepped aside, and Marin Holloway rose from the leather chair in the library of the Ashbury Conservatory and walked past him into the hallway, where Coleridge Sands was waiting to show her to a car driven by a man named Petrus, who would, as promised, ask her no questions on the drive home. Crane stayed in the library after she left. He stood at the tall window for a long time, looking down over the river at the lights of the working districts laid out below, and he thought about a woman in a gray dress in a doorway in Halverton, and he thought about his promise, and he thought, very quietly, that a promise kept once was not the same as a promise kept always, but that it was, at 64 years of age, finally enough to begin. Petrus drove slowly. He had been told over the course of 12 years that the speed of the car was a form of conversation, and that a passenger who had been through something required a slower conversation than a passenger who had not. He took the long way back, through the Brevard district and along the river road, and he did not turn on the radio, and he did not speak. And Marin Holloway sat in the back seat with a handkerchief in her lap and the locket at her throat and watched the lights of Bellbrook move past her window in long, soft streaks. She did not cry in the car. She had cried in the library, and the library had taken what it was going to take, and the car was a different place with a different agreement. Her apartment was on the 4th floor of a brick building on Crestmore Street, above a bakery that had been closed for 2 years and a tailor's shop that opened only on Thursdays. The stairwell smelled of the bakery's ghost. The hallway light on the 4th floor had been out for 6 weeks, and the building manager had stopped responding to her notes about it, and she had grown used to letting herself in by the feel of the key. She let herself in by the feel of the key now. She closed the door. She turned the lock. She set her clutch on the small table in the entryway, and she stood in the dark hallway of her apartment in her dove-gray dress, and she did something she had not done in 18 months. She slid down the wall to the floor. She did not collapse. She did not faint. She simply lowered herself, with the careful, slow control of a woman who had decided that the floor was, for the moment, the only piece of furniture she could trust, and she sat with her back against the door and her knees against her chest and her dress arranged around her, and she put her face into her hands, and she made a sound. The sound was not a sob. It was not a wail. It was the noise a body makes when it has been holding something for a long time and is finally permitted to set the thing down. It was not graceful. Wesley would not have recognized it. She had not made it for him. She had not, in 18 months, been able to make it for him, because the grief she had carried for him had been the public kind, the legible kind, the kind other people knew how to respond to. The sound she made now was a different grief. It was the grief of having been laughed at in a place full of strangers in a dress her dead husband had never seen, and it was the grief of having been seen, finally, by a man whose mother had once stood in a doorway in Pennsylvania, and it was the grief of having sat in a chair that had not asked her to keep carrying anything, and the grief of those 3 things together had a sound, and the sound came out of her now, on the floor of her dark hallway, and she let it. When it was done, she sat for a long time with her cheek against her knees. Then she lifted her head. She unclasped the back of the locket. She unfolded the scrap of hospital notepaper. She read the 7 lines. She read the 6th one twice. Be kind to the next man who notices you. And Marin Holloway, sitting on the floor of a 4th-floor apartment on Crestmore Street, in a dove-gray dress that no longer felt like a dress for memorials, said aloud to the empty hallway, in a voice steadier than any she had used in 18 months. I think I was, Wes. I think I was. She refolded the paper. She closed the locket. She rose from the floor. She walked to the long wall of the living room, where the piano had stood untouched for a year and a half, and she did the thing she had not done in all that time. She laid her palm flat against the wood. And she waited, and after a moment the wood was warm. She slept that night, for the first time in 18 months, with the window open. Imogen Drexler called at 7:41 in the morning. She had a voice that sounded like a knife being unwrapped from cloth. Not threatening, but precise, with the small, clean ring of a tool that had been kept sharp on purpose. She introduced herself. She asked Marin 3 questions about the debt. She asked Marin to scan and email every document she had. She told Marin that she would not be contacted by any of the 3 collection agencies again, beginning at 5 o'clock that afternoon, and that any further contact from any party regarding the debt should be forwarded directly to her, and that Marin should not, under any circumstance, speak to any of them. The calls stopped at 4:57 that afternoon. By Friday, the debt had been settled in full. By the following Tuesday, the credit reporting had been corrected. By the end of the month, a small letter arrived at Marin's apartment from St. Adelaide's Children's Hospital, signed by the chairwoman herself, Adair Pennick, expressing the hospital's regret that any family member of Dr. Wesley Holloway had ever been pursued for medical debt arising from his own treatment, and announcing a new internal policy, effective immediately, that no surviving spouse of a hospital employee would be billed for any portion of that employee's care that exceeded what was covered by insurance. The policy was retroactive by 20 years. 17 other families received letters in the same week. Marin read the letter twice, and she folded it, and she placed it in a drawer with her tax documents, because she had decided, somewhere in the previous weeks, that she would not turn the kindness she had received into a reason to be photographed beside it either. The car was returned to her building on Wednesday morning at 11:58. Petrus had driven it himself. He left the keys with the building manager who, for reasons the manager did not understand, had also that morning received a phone call from someone at the City Housing Authority inquiring about the status of certain hallway lighting on the 4th floor of his building, and by Friday the hallway light had been replaced, and the bulb was a brighter wattage than the one before it. At Pemberton Shipping, the contracts review began on the 2nd Tuesday of the following month. It was conducted by an outside firm. It identified more than 100 separate clauses that had been operating on grandfathered terms for between 9 and 14 years, and it recommended renegotiation on all of them. The board accepted the recommendations. The renegotiation took 6 months. By the end of it, Pemberton Shipping had lost a substantial portion of its harbor margin, which the firm absorbed without insolvency, but not without consequence, and Hollis Pemberton, who had been groomed since boyhood to take over the firm, spent the 6 months of the renegotiation in a series of conversations with his board, in which he was asked, repeatedly, why the renegotiation had occurred, and he was unable, in any of those conversations, to give an answer that satisfied anyone, including himself. He developed, during those 6 months, a small persistent twitch in his left eyelid. He never knew why. He never connected it to a microphone and a parquet floor, and a woman in a dove-gray dress, because the connection had been engineered to be invisible, and Crane Vosberg's engineering, when it was good, was the kind that the engineered party never identified. The story of what had happened at the Ashbury Conservatory traveled through Bellrook the way such stories travel. Slowly at first, then all at once. By the 2nd week, 3 different versions were in circulation. By the 2nd month, the versions had merged into a single account that was not quite accurate, but was close enough to the truth that the truth itself stopped objecting. The version that survived was this: that a young widow had been laughed at in a public ballroom, and that a man whose name was not spoken had silenced the place, and that the woman had walked out with her dignity, and that several people who had laughed had, in the months that followed, come to understand that laughter had a price that was not always paid by the person who had been laughed at. Adair Pennick wrote Marin a personal letter 4 weeks after the gala. The letter did not mention the auction. It mentioned only that the hospital would, in the future, honor Dr. Holloway's memory with an annual lecture in pediatric cardiothoracic surgery, and that Marin would be welcome at the lecture every year for as long as she wished to attend, and that she would never again be required to wear a dress to it that she had not chosen for herself. Marin attended the first lecture 6 months later, in a navy blue dress she had bought on Pearl Street with her own money, and she sat in the second row, and she did not touch her locket once. At the back of the auditorium, a man in a slate gray suit listened to the entire lecture from a seat near the door, and he left before the applause, and he did not come forward, and Maureen, who had felt his presence the way one feels the presence of a familiar weather, did not turn around. She had no use for confirmation. 2 years later, on a Thursday afternoon in early April, the bakery beneath Marin Holloway's apartment opened again under new ownership. The new owner was a woman named Sable Marchetti, who had moved to Bellrook from a town in southern Vermont after her own husband had died, and who had decided at the age of 41 that she would spend the second half of her life making bread. She had bought the lease on the bakery for less than it was worth from a building manager who had received, 2 years earlier, an unexplained instruction from a party he did not name to keep the lease available for a buyer of the right kind, and the building manager, who had stopped asking why certain things in the building happened the way they happened, had simply held the lease and waited, and Sable had walked in on a Tuesday, and the manager had shown her the kitchen, and the matter had settled itself within an afternoon. Marin took to going down in the mornings. She had given up her job at the stationer's 6 months after the gala, when Imogen Drexler had connected her to a small foundation that funded grief counseling for surviving spouses of medical professionals, and the foundation had asked her to coordinate its outreach, and she had said yes, and the foundation had been her work ever since. She had a desk now, and a salary, and a small office in a building near the hospital, and on her desk she kept a single framed photograph of Wesley standing in a kitchen with a wooden spoon, and beside it she kept a small folded handkerchief that she had never returned, because she had decided, somewhere in the months after the gala, that the handkerchief was the only object in her apartment whose meaning she was unwilling to negotiate with. On the Thursday morning in April, Marin sat at the small round table in the front window of Sable's bakery with a cup of coffee and a slice of cardamom bread, and she watched the street, and she thought about nothing in particular. The locket was at her throat. It was warm, the way it had always been warm, but it was no longer the warmest thing she was wearing, because she had bought herself a wool cardigan the previous winter, and the cardigan had, over the months, become the warmest thing in her wardrobe, and she had begun to think of the locket as a thing she carried rather than a thing she relied on, which was, she understood, a kind of progress. A black car slowed at the curb across the street. Marin saw it without looking at it. She had developed, in the years since the gala, a quiet awareness of certain kinds of cars, not because she was watching for them, but because they had a particular weight on a street, and she had learned to feel the weight without turning her head. The car did not park. It idled. The driver was a man she did not recognize, not Petrus, who had retired the previous year to a small town near the Maine border after 12 years of taking only the long way home. The new driver was younger. He kept his eyes forward. In the back seat of the car, a man in a slate gray suit looked through the front window of the bakery for a long moment. He could see, through the glass, the shape of a woman sitting at a round table with a cup of coffee. He could see her hand resting beside the cup, not holding it. He could see, faintly, the small pewter shape at her throat. He could not see her face clearly. He had no need to. He could see the way she was sitting, the way her shoulders were not curved inward, the way her hand was not at her throat, the way she was not, in any visible way, apologizing for the fact of her own presence in the place she was occupying. He had not spoken to her in 2 years and 4 months. He had not wanted to. He had not needed to. He had read through Imogen and Coleridge and the small, careful network of people whose job it was to know things without being asked, that Mrs. Holloway had taken a position with a foundation, that she was no longer in arrears, that she had begun to attend lectures in her late husband's name, and that the locket had been seen, on one occasion, hanging from a hook beside her desk rather than around her throat. Which was, the report had noted, the kind of detail that signified. He had read the reports the way a man reads a long letter from someone who has finally learned to be all right. In the back seat of the car, Crane Vosberg closed his eyes for a moment. He was 66 years old now. The hair at his temples had gone fully white. The fleck in his left eye had grown. He had 3 years left, perhaps 4, before the body that had been honed for 40 years would begin, finally, to ask for a slower kind of work. He did not mind. He had made his arrangements. Coleridge would inherit what mattered. Imogen would manage what could not be inherited. The harbor would forget him within a decade. The city would not. But the city's memory was not the memory that mattered to him. The memory that mattered was a doorway in Halverton, Pennsylvania, in the spring of 1971, and a woman in a gray dress with her hand at her throat, and a 9-year-old boy standing behind her, and the small, impossible weight of a promise he had carried for 57 years. He had thought, when he made the promise, that keeping it would feel like setting something down. It did not. It felt instead like discovering that the weight had become a part of his body, and that he had grown around it, and that he no longer needed to set it down because he had finally learned how to carry it without flinching. The promise had not been kept once. It had been kept on a Tuesday morning in October, when a woman in a dove-gray dress had read a letter from a hospital. It had been kept on a Wednesday afternoon when a car had been returned to a curb. It had been kept on a Thursday evening when a foundation had hired a coordinator. It had been kept in 100 small, invisible ways, in 100 small, invisible places, and it would continue to be kept in places he would never enter, by people who would never know his name, until the keeping became, in the end, the only inheritance he cared about leaving. He opened his eyes. He looked through the window of the bakery one more time. The woman at the table had picked up her coffee. She was holding it in both hands, the way a person holds something warm, not because she required the warmth, but because she had remembered, in the moment of picking it up, that warmth was a thing one was permitted to enjoy. Crane Vosberg said 2 words to his driver. "Drive on." The car moved away from the curb. It moved slowly down Crestmore Street, past the tailor's shop and the corner grocery, and the small park where the magnolias had begun, that week, to bloom. It turned right at the River Road. It did not return. Inside the bakery, Marin Holloway lifted her cup of coffee to her mouth. She felt for a moment the ghost of a man's attention on the back of her neck, the particular weight of a kindness that had once been directed at her by a man she had met for the better part of an hour in a library above a river. She did not turn around. She had learned, somewhere in the past 2 years, that some attentions did not require acknowledgement, because the acknowledgement had already been given, in the way she sat now, in the way she breathed now, in the way her thumb no longer reached for the clasp of her locket whenever a stranger entered a room. She set the coffee down. She broke a piece of cardamom bread. She put it in her mouth. Outside, the spring light fell across Bellbrook in the soft, slow way it fell every April. And somewhere beyond the river road, a black car carried a man toward an arrangement he had spent a lifetime maintaining. And somewhere above the conservatory on Linden Hill, a chandelier hung with 1 fewer crystal than it had hung with 2 years before. In the long memory of a man who had finally stopped flinching, a doorway in Halverton stood open, and a woman in a gray dress turned, at last, away from a deacon who had not deserved her apology, and walked back into a kitchen where a 9-year-old boy was waiting for her. And she did not say, "I'm sorry this time," because she had nothing, any longer, to apologize for. The world had not changed. but in one small corner of it, a man had not looked away, and that, in the end, had been enough.